Shading in art is very important because it's what allows us to give depth to the things we draw. Without shading, everything looks flat. Add a little bit of shading though, and suddenly a flat drawing starts to look 3D. It starts to look more real, more impressive. But it's hard to shade well. So how do you do it? What kind of stuff is best to practice? So many questions. Well, you're in the right place because we're going to go over all of it in this week's episode of YouTube Art School. Marked in the timeline below, we'll see what's the logic behind shading, what are the different types of shading, what are some different shading styles, what kind of method works best to shade your drawings digitally, what kind of tools or brushes you'll need to master shading, and what's the best way to practice shading. Basically everything you're gonna need to go from 0 to 100 at shading in a nice compact format. And all of it right here for free. Although I do accept mandatory donations of either 1 like or 1 sub. Thank you. Alright, let's start off with the basics and try giving this flat 2D shape some shading to help make it look like a 3D shape, or a 3D volume instead. I think most people would just darken the edges while keeping the center light, right? That looks kind of 3D, but this also looks 3D. Can you tell the difference between the two? If you thought about the lighting, you would be correct. In the first example, the light source looks like it's basically beaming out of our own eyes, which is why the center is lighter. But in this other example, the light source seems to be coming from around here maybe. In both cases though, the surface of the object that's facing the light source most directly seems to be the lightest. So it's important to keep in mind the lighting when shading. Here's another example. These are all octagon cylinders seen from the top, and here's a light source. Using the same logic, out of all of its faces, this one here seems to be facing the light source most directly, so that would be the lightest, while these faces would be black because they point completely to the side, like they're not at an angle where they can reflect any light. Now these faces in between though can probably reflect some light, like not much as this one, but more than not reflecting any. So we'll pick a shade of gray like in between white and black, which is why when we look at this at an angle now, the shading for that cylinder might look something like this. So without going into the physics of things too much, just remember surfaces facing the light source most directly will appear the brightest, while surfaces not facing the light source will appear darker. And the less they face the light, the darker they get. So if I quickly add 2 more cylinders in here, I can identify these faces as those facing the light most directly, these a little, and these not at all. So if we go back to the perspective view, that's what the shading should look like in this specific case. Objects won't always have clear faces like these low poly cylinders though, so often the surface is smooth, but the same logic still applies. Like I could easily smooth out these cylinders using a smudge brush, and that right here would be the same result as if I had started with a circular top for this one instead of an octagon like the other two. Now that we got the basics, what I've talked about so far is only what I'll call directional shading. Shading volumes based on their orientation to the light source. It's a big part of the shading process, but it's not all of it. There's a second type of shading that we call ambient occlusion shading in 3D game development, at least. That's where I learned it. And it's basically the absence of light you get when 2 objects get so close to each other that they trap the light in between them and then prevent it from escaping. It's the same kind of as when you have a deep crack in something, or like how the inside of your nostrils look pitch black, right, from the outside. Light goes in, but it can never leave. It gets trapped in there and it never reflects back out. So to our eyes, that just looks like black. Full shading is basically a combination of those 2 types of shading, directional and ambient occlusion. This is just a really quick pass of ambient occlusion shading. Looks alright, but it's not clear where the light is coming from. But then onto that we add directional shading on top, and then it looks a lot more 3D. Wow. The most important thing is to start by shading the overall volumes. Like if I have this leg with all its details here, the overall volumes would be something like these 2 cylinders. So shade that as if you were just shading cylinders with a bit of shadow on each side. Easy. From there, we have to think of the ambient occlusion to finalize the shading. Let's use the same logic for all of these muscles. They're all very close together, so the light should get trapped between them, resulting in something like this. Now let's add back the overall volume shading we had initially, and we get some pretty nice shading very quickly. Give this a shot. Now, real quick, shading doesn't come in only one flavor either. Regular smooth shading like we've seen so far is one type, but you also have like comic style shading where there's some soft shading like we've seen before, but then there's an abrupt transition to bold black shadows, which in a way is similar to cell shading, yet another different style of shading where the usual smooth gradual transition from light to dark is completely gone. Instead, we'll use darker flat colors with a hard edge for those shadows. The logic on how they're placed is exactly the same, so it shouldn't be any harder really. It's just a different look. If anything, it's easier because there's nothing to smooth out. And we'll look at how to do both smooth and cell shading digitally next. But first, here's the sponsor of this video. Me. But like I mentioned last week, the Halloween sale for my art program is happening now, so you'll be able to pick up the world's most popular university equivalent art education at a massive discount for a couple more days. Make sure you check the link in the description below to find all the deets and find out when it ends, because I don't want you to miss out on this. Students get lifetime access, free updates forever, and private access to the school's Discord to level up alongside thousands of other like-minded artists. Check it out below, you'll be happy you did. Alright, now I've shown these coloring setups in previous classes, so this will be more of a quick summary, but here's how I go about setting up my layers for both cell shading and smooth shading. They're both the same. So here's my very simple layer setup. As you can see here, I have the background at the bottom, then my flats layer, which is just like coloring within the lines. Now, to be fair, I had a sketch in here initially to guide me, but I deleted it since, or rather it kind of transformed into my shading layer because I just kept, adding the shading on top of it. And that shading layer looks like this. So if you remember the basics we looked at, the way I shade is first without worrying about the light direction. So it's all shaded as if the light was beaming out of my eyes, right? Like the center of every shape is lighter while the outsides are darker. I'm not considering any other light source coming from any other direction. And this is both the ambient occlusion and the directional shading combined. But yeah, it's only later that I'll worry about the lighting, and I actually have separate layers just for that. So I'll just paint with light over the shaded layer, brightening the surfaces that face that light source most directly. In this case, you can imagine the actual light source in my scene is probably coming from around here. And I find it a lot more convenient to split the shading process this way, since it allows me to change the light direction if I need it later, like in case I change my mind. And I can also individually color my lights any way that I want them. This would be a lot harder if I had shaded everything on just one layer. And then on top of my layer stack, I'll have some reflections to help define my materials better, with more reflections on shiny materials and less on rough surfaces, etc. So yeah, this is how I approach shading for reals. It's a workflow that I actually highly recommend. It's simple and easy to adapt. Give it a shot. Now, it's one thing to know how to set up your layers and work with a solid method like the one I demonstrated, but the tools you'll use to shade matter just as much, if not more. It's your lucky day though, because as a pro, I've been fine-tuning the process for years, so you don't have to. These are the only two tools that I use to do it all. The first one is a custom brush that I made that looks like this, with a sharp edge and a soft one. This allows me to shade extremely quickly using just a couple of brush strokes. Check this out. Are you kidding me? You're not being efficient if you don't have a brush like this. And you can easily make one yourself, but I also sell mine as part of my advanced brush set, so you can check my profile for the link if you're lazy. But that's usually not quite enough to allow me to do everything though. So this is where the second tool comes into play. It's the lasso tool and the soft brush combo. It's very similar in a way, but it allows for even more control. And you'll find a basic soft brush like this in any painting software, so there's really nothing to make this time. You already have access to it. But yeah, check out the crazy cool stuff that you can do with these two little simple tools. Wow. But yeah, with those tools, you should be able to shade anything like a pro. Which brings me to the last part of this class. Practice. What the heck can you do to practice shading? Well, I have 3 exercises for you. The 3 best that I recommend to all my students. A lot of you know this already, but I used to work at Blizzard some years ago as a 3D artist, and I think all the hours that I spent looking at 3D models, rotating the lights around them, and like seeing in real time the effect on the shading was a huge help. So the first thing I would recommend would be to use a 3D reference like Magic Poser Web here when shading your characters. Or if you need references to shade simple volumes like boxes, spheres, and cylinders, etc. The more you play around with that, the more your eye for correct shading will develop. Really important to start playing around those 3D tools. Now, the second exercise I'd recommend would be to do artist studies. Not a huge surprise, probably, but find professional artists because they're probably less likely to have shading mistakes in their work, and copy their shading. If it helps, I offer a bunch of exercise files on my QBrush store with line art drawings that you can practice shading with. But regardless of the reference you use, always make it black and white before starting to shade. You're practicing shading here, not coloring, and the colors will totally get in the way. So get rid of them. And then my last exercise, the last thing I recommend you practice to get the most results will be a little counterintuitive, maybe, but practice drawing simple volumes in space, like in this class where I go over my top God tier drawing exercises. This will be a huge boost to your shading game. Shading is all about thinking like an artist, like thinking in 3D instead of 2D. Practicing drawing those volumes will help you gradually shift your way of thinking, and it should eventually, naturally, help you improve your shading without directly having to practice it. When you understand how volumes behave in 3D space, shading becomes second nature almost. So I'll leave a link to that class here in a second on the screen in case you were looking for God tier exercises to practice. But yeah, hopefully what we looked at today was helpful. Let me know in the comments, and hopefully your shading game will be a bit stronger from now on. Alright, I'll see you in the next class.